I want to talk about trade-offs as a model in basic translation theory. A model is just a theoretical construct, an idea, a collection of variables about what could happen. Now, I do this within a particular framework, which I'll just run through to put the foundations in place. I propose that cooperation is the aim of all communication, including translation. I see risk, communicative risk, as the probability of non-cooperation. So communication fails when there's no cooperation, and we can measure the risk of that happening, or we can estimate it. In order to achieve cooperation, you need trust, and trust is the capacity to predict the other's behavior and response. And so to enable future cooperation, trust is necessary for economic prosperity and social cohesion, in a democratic view, at least. And these concepts are interesting to me because when you're communicating across cultures, the trust level is lower because there's less prior knowledge and less capacity to predict the reactions of the other. And this means that communicative risks are greater. So translation is just another act of communication as far as I'm concerned, but because it's going between cultures and between languages, risk and trust become very important to deal with, okay? And this means that when we're dealing with translation, we have to be particularly aware of the risks involved. That is, we have to use that in our pedagogy, where we're teaching people how to translate or giving them ideas about how to translate, and in public policy concerning cross-cultural communication, translation policy, if you will. I'll come to that at the end, I think. Now, how does a trade-off fit into that? I'm going to propose that when we're translating, we are making choices, we're identifying problems. A lot of translating is not problem solving, I know, but the things I'm concerned about are, and the problems require a choice between alternatives. It's a non-mechanical choice to make it interesting. Okay, if it's mechanical, then it's probably not translation, it's probably just applying a glossary or applying obligatory grammar. Now, here's an example. We've got this term guanxi in Chinese, which la guanxi can mean unfair competition. Okay, and how do we translate that into English? It could be connections. How'd you get the job? I used my connections. In Spanish, the term is enchufe, which is what I've got there, a plug going in, right? And that would be a possible translation. Is it a good one? Well, yeah, but it doesn't tell us anything about it being specifically Chinese or a different practice. I could talk about using one's relations because family is part of it and relationships. We might refer to the Chinese use of social networks, for example, or use of social networks as such. If we looked around in English language cultures, we might find parallel concepts such as the old boys network, the old school tie, for example. These would all be possible translations. A foot in the door. How'd you get the job? Well, I had a foot in the door because I knew such and such, my brother-in-law. All right, we can go beyond those one-term solutions, though, and look at complex solutions, such as using the term guanxi, explaining what it means, guanxi plus the Chinese network of social obligations. A bigger explanation is here. How'd you get the job? Well, use social context, as the Chinese tend to do, all right? Got the job by leveraging social guanxi. You'll find there are simple solutions and there are complex solutions. And mostly a translator just has to choose one, or one in one particular place, and then you can use others in other places in the text. And some of these solutions are going to be more successful than others, successful at achieving cooperation. So what can we do with that kind of problem? A current approach in translation studies, traditional even, is to have a line going from domesticating to foreignizing. Sometimes it's literal to free, but let's stick with this particular line, this binary approach, and we could take all those solutions and place them at different points along that line and say, well, the translator opt for a domesticating strategy over here or a foreignizing strategy over here. Okay. And that's fine. And we can do that. I've just done that with that example. I don't think, though, that we really know what foreignization is, or to be more exact, foreignization could mean many things. In this research, which is actually a set of 3 papers, asking readers how they approached and evaluated translations of Gone with the Wind, where there are 2 translations into Chinese, and academic specialists had identified one as domesticating and the other as foreignizing. And so people were asked to answer questions on foreignization. And the result was that the results were the 2 translations, the 2 renditions, were statistically more indistinguishable than distinguishable. Okay, so there was just no good p-value, no statistically significant difference between the translations. So what happened? What the theorists say should happen didn't happen in actual reception. And when you go through the questions asked there, these 10 questions here, the ones in red, I think, did give a difference between the translations, but the other didn't. The problem to me seems to be that foreignization could be any one or any combination of any of these. We have no guarantee that these are separate variables, separate things that people looked for or appreciated or needed when they were receiving the translation. And so we get back to this more serious problem of if we've got foreignization, domestication, what are the values actually involved there in the act of receiving a translation? Is it all of these operating together? Obviously not, because those are not the results that were gained. So what is happening? We could look at these in isolation, say, oh, well, foreignization is when the text is located in a foreign country. All right, that's one reason. Or it's when it's strange to read. It's marked as being non-standard, or it's when it's hard to understand. But those could all be 3 entirely different things. Now, I'm going back to the idea of trade-offs now. Trade-offs found all over the place. Some places quite close to us. And they tend to be simplified as relations where one gains something of one value and something of the other at the same time. Okay, so instead of the more domestication, the less foreignization. Okay, it's if you win there, you lose there. A trade-off is the idea that you can win on both things at the same time. Okay, so that's the conceptual framework. In the years of COVID, we've had different countries, different governments enact different kinds of trade-offs. The main values being between pandemic control, lockdowns, wearing a mask, etc., and maintaining economic activity. And so there are different ways of doing these 2 things, or a bit of control here, a bit of lockdown here, open up at a certain stage after vaccination, etc. But for most of the policies, the aim was to get a bit of both at the same time, or to reduce the amount of this in order to maintain that. Okay, and so in different countries we've lived through that. We could see political systems in the same way. A political system needs stability, but it also needs a level of debate in order to evolve. And the trick is to have a political system that has both of these at the same time. Different countries have different degrees of stability and different degrees of free debate. We can look at these in terms of complex systems, of course. The one that's closest, though, to classical literary theory, and thereby probably translation theory, goes back to Horace in the Ars Poetica, where I'll give the Loeb translation, the aim of the effective poem is to join the instructive with the agreeable, in order to at once warn and delight the reader. So the great aesthetic text has a moral virtue. You will learn from it, but there will be pleasure at the same time, and you get these together. Of course, if you become too pleasurable, the moral value goes down, erotic poetry, for example, and if it becomes too pedagogical, the pleasure goes down, a boring class, for example, okay? So we have models of trade-offs around us. Those are some of the classical ones, or the ones closest to us. Now, in my problem with translation, I'm interested in certain kinds of values, okay? And they're reducing certain kinds of risks. So to go back to the guanxi, okay? If I just use an English term, relationships or network or connections, I convey something of the understanding of what's at stake, but I lose the cultural specification of it being specifically Chinese. All right. So if I went for them, I would have low specificity or cultural location. If I just use the term guanxi, written as such in English or in Latin letters, I'm going to get the specificity, but I lose on the understanding. But if I use a complex solution got the job by leveraging social guanxi, I've got the social location, the language, the specificity, and I've got some understanding. I'm getting both at the same time. Okay, so some translations can do that. It's easy because that's a complex solution. So I'm just taking something from both sides, putting it together. If I can understand this in terms of two risks, the risk would be not understanding, and I can handle that risk by selecting any of these. The other risk would be not understanding the location, and I can handle that risk by selecting these, okay? But I can also do the two at the same time. We could map this, understanding on this axis here going up, location or specificity on this axis over here. If I have connections, I have understanding but not location. If I have guanxi, I have location but not understanding. And so we can position these other solutions at various points along that line, wherever we like in that space. Not wherever we like, wherever the data we get, or our estimates, if we have no particular data, can place it. And so trade-offs are going to be particularly successful in this particular space. And I've avoided at least the linear binarism of two poles and just positioning one at points along there. Instead of one line, I now have two, okay, two axes. Now, how can trade-offs be studied? I think that at the beginning, we have to say any value, any criteria can be pertinent. I could posit that, in all cases, we have understanding and specificity, but when I get to the actual data from reception, I can see that these are actually not pertinent. People don't discuss those things in all cases. So in theory, any values, any criteria can be pertinent to a trade-off. I think it's more interesting to look at the reception effects, that trade-offs happening in the way people receive translations, rather than in the decision-making of the translator. We can get data from both sides. Personally, I think that we know least about the way translations are received. And so I'm more interested in that as trade-offs in reception effects. And what I'm looking at here concerns that side, not the decision-making of the translator, but people can do that if you have some data. And therefore, I start from what receivers say about their reception process. In the research that we've been doing on this, I'm giving some examples in a minute, and I'm stealing from my previous doctoral students who've done great work on this. We have used several methods. You can use eye tracking, you can use think aloud protocols. The ones that are most successful here for the analysis of trade-offs seem to be interview data, post hoc, that is after the reception process, and particularly the ones that occur in group discussions or focus group discussions, where a group of people sit around and discuss the different ways they evaluate different translations. Okay, but it's very free. You're free to experiment with different methodologies, but those are the ones that we've been using. So here is a prior doctoral student, now an up-and-coming scholar, Bei Hu, at the National University of Singapore at the moment. This is an example of a failed trade-off, all right? The ST has one translation, which we can give here. The China-Australia Free Trade Agreement has achieved a goal of comprehensiveness, high quality, and balanced interests, which is of great significance. Sounds like a pretty normal Chinese-based translation, okay? Good things, all right? We've got this free trade agreement, produce good things. Second solution, comprehensively enhance economic and trade cooperation between the two countries. This is a simpler translation and forward-looking. And a third one, the Chinese government believes in the benefits of free trade and is committed to robust trade relationships with other nations that value fairness and reciprocity. So what happened is we give people who don't know Chinese these three translations, and we ask them to evaluate them, to discuss them and see what happens. Now, some people will say, oh, this sounds bureaucratic, 1, 2, 3, boring. This I understand because it's more exciting and future-oriented. What's interesting is that if we assume that the aim of the text is to make the reader feel good about the agreement, the other aim would be to express the sender's commitment to the agreement. Okay, so I'm getting two communicative aims here, but why am I getting them? It's because we get negative reactions in some cases. Okay, and the most extreme reaction here by an Australian reader who doesn't know Chinese was against TT3. You can't be extolling the virtue of free trade and still call yourself a communist. It doesn't sound honest. So what's happened here is that the communication has failed because the Chinese government believes in the benefits of free trade, has simply not resonated with this reader. The reader has said, this is not a valid translation because, hey, it's too good to be true. I do not believe it. It has failed, all right? And so we can see that one of the values at work here in this particular text is to get the reader to believe in the sincerity or authenticity of the sender, which is why I had that second aim there. Okay, so we can test trade-offs and see them operating and see which values are pertinent when they fail, when communication fails, when we have a loss of trust. Obviously, in this case, we can go back and figure out, well, why was trust lost? What were the values involved? And then start looking for the trade-offs on that basis. If we just map out two variables here, understanding is still there. We have to know what's going on. And then the other one would be this trustworthiness, sincerity. I'll just call it authenticity because it's a concept that still has to be explored in translation studies. We can see that the translation, China believes in free trade, is understandable but lacks authenticity, therefore fails as a trade-off. And these are positioned more in the middle and are more successful. They do get degrees of both of these values. Okay. That was Bay's work. Bay has many, many more examples. She calls trade-offs compromises in her publications on this. Compromise is fine as well. I sort of like trade-off because it has an economic background and it seems more positive than a compromise where you're losing something all the time. A trade-off, you're gaining two things at the same time. The same word, just two different things. I'm stealing this example from Ke Hu, who is another doctoral student, now working at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So all my doctoral students have left me. No, these two have. Right? The essay here we have in English, and we're going into Chinese. It's from an early Agatha Christie. What is it? The Mysterious Affair at Styles, or something like that. Where an English gentleman comes on and meets this alluring lady and sees in her eyes the vivid sense of slumbering fire. Well, this is difficult to understand for us today. Slumbering comes from the technology of where you have a fire in a house that's always alight. It would be the stove or the fireplace, but usually in the houses I've known in my family, there's a stove, and you would cut off the airflow to it during the night. So it wouldn't go out, you would have the embers, it would be slumbering, and then the next day you open up the airflow and it comes alive, okay? So the sense is that this woman probably has some sexual fire that could be released if the slumber were overcome. Let's suggest. Anyway, there we go. The vivid sense of slumbering fire. Difficult to understand because we don't have fires like that anymore, do we? Anyway, TT1, the vivid feeling of deeply sleeping fire. This is a Chinese. It sounds strange in Chinese as it does in English, okay? The vivid aura of mildly burning fire. Now that's doing a bit better because deeply sleeping is a bit weird for a fire, but mildly burning is closer to the technology that I just explained. And the third translation, showing yet concealing lively expression. Okay, and there's some features here that we will talk about in a minute. Now, what Ke did was different. He got readers to go over the translations and mark out what they liked and disliked, okay? And so you could go back to these color maps of likes and dislikes and see what was happening with each particular solution. So this solution here was disliked more than liked, okay? This was the deeply sleeping fire, which is, yeah, what's going on here, huh? The middle one, more likes and very few dislikes, okay? So this one happened to the mildly, what was it? Let's go back and see. The mildly burning fire, okay? Did pretty well. And this one had less likes, or fewer here, okay? And fewer dislikes, all right? So we could say that on the whole, the middle one was more successful, and this one is interesting as well, but not as interesting. Now, Ke got people to talk about this, and let's see what they said. So the middle one there, with a vivid sense of slumbering fire, got likes, and people were saying, yes, it's easier for me to understand, so understanding. Whereas the third one was too blurry, okay? So, plus understanding or minus understanding. If we just do that analysis on that data, we're talking about what you understand, what you don't understand. There's no trade-off. We can just say, this one was vague and this one was clear, therefore go for that one. No trade-off involved. However, we could have TT1 okay, which was hard to understand and not beautiful. We lost on the understanding and we lost on the aesthetics. We might see it as an attempted trade-off, but it's going to be, near zero for both of those. And so it's not a very good trade-off. All right. But we can see that understanding is there and aesthetics is there, okay, because it's a literary text. And it sounds like it should be a rather literary phrase. TT2, which is the one that did best, got interesting reactions, okay? Enabled him to see a close-up shot of the character's face, fire-like glows in her eyes. Somebody else says, an image that the girl has vivid expressions in her eyes. These are Chinese readers. Vivid, they use that all the time. And then one actually says, it's a pity that the third translation, which left out the fire, you remember, did not have this line. Okay. So TT2 is winning because we've got comprehensibility, understanding, scoring very highly, and it has aesthetic value. Okay, and we can see that as a trade-off, it's working better than the first one, which was hard to understand. Okay, and now TT3, which actually got rid of the fire, is interesting because it uses a Chengyu. It uses this 4-character expression here, which has reference back to classical Chinese poetry. And so it's introducing its own aesthetic resources. It's getting rid of the fire, but it's putting in a Chengyu to suggest something that is shown yet concealed. Okay. Now, the readers here understood what was going on, but had doubts about the aesthetics. Simply puts together some seemingly fancy words, but in comparison with the second translation, it's not very clear. Another person says, it seems contrived. They're talking about this here. They say, it's a little too much. It's over the top. So we get a translation that's relatively successful. It has comprehensibility because we got rid of the metaphor, essentially, and it has aesthetics, but there's a division of opinion about the aesthetics. So it's been taking a particular risk here in drawing on Chinese-based resources, which for some readers simply didn't work. It lost out on that value of authenticity that I mentioned. Now, this study is interesting because the TT1 that we saw was raw machine translation, which did get understanding and did get aesthetics, but didn't score highly on both. So it's a trade-off, but not successful, okay? TT2 is a post-edit, a light post-edit of the machine translation, and it scored well on understanding. TT3 is a published translation, which scored less than the post-edited machine translation. That's the interest of the research, I think, and scored highly on aesthetics, but there was this division of opinion about the aesthetics, so it was taking a risk there. Now, what's interesting about the trade-off analysis is that we can get these two axes and map where our particular translations fit in and illustrate what one is good at. Illustrate that the post-edited MT can be better in some cases, than a published translation. Now, I'm going to move into some of the problems with doing this kind of analysis. So far, I've been showing just two axes. And the problem is, are there just two variables? So understanding a location for Guanxi, it could be authenticity for the other example, it could be aesthetics, okay? I wonder if understanding is always there. It is in the data that we get, but I think that really it is possible to reduce your approach to just two if you want. Holmes did this, for example. He considered, when analyzing poetry translations, that there must be enough invariance. It must be enough like the ST in order to be considered a translation, and it must have enough target culture conventions to be considered a poem. And so the two things have to be there, but that's a theoretical imposition. If we work bottom up, though, from the data from what people say, I don't think there's any limit to the number of things that people could mention. So those two axes, even if you have understanding as a basic one, or acceptance as a translation as another one, you can imagine both of them going around, and it could be a sphere. I mean, I don't see any reason to restrict it to just 2 or 3 or 4. I'll come back to that one in a minute, though. Now, some of the questions that are addressed by the idea of trade-offs, or can be addressed. I'll go back to this from Venuti. When he looks for a translation that can set off an event which will bring about new ways of thinking, inspired by an interpretation. And here it seems to me is a one-sided valuation. The translation is good when it makes people think differently. I've no doubt that's true, but is it the only value? This seems to me not thinking in terms of trade-offs. It seems to be thinking in terms of one principle: event, change, good. Now, what's interesting is that in announcing this ethical position, he does away with other things. A translation that does this should not be faulted merely for exhibiting features that are commonly called unethical. Wholesale manipulation of the source text, so that's okay. You don't care about invariance. Ignorance of the source language, that's okay. If you don't know the language too well, that's not a criterion here. Plagiarism of other translations, that's okay too, as long as you create an event. Okay? A one-sided evaluation. Now, the problem for me is that often, if a translation is used in order to introduce new ways of thinking into a culture, it's used as a translation because it gains authority and force. So you could look at this text translations that have introduced new ways of thinking. A text will come in, the sutras will come into Chinese as the word of the Buddha, okay, or as the word of inspired sages, as the word of Jesus, as the word of Marx, as the word of Mao, as the word of my government, as the word of science. If it's a translation, it gains a special force, a special authority, to the extent that it can be accepted as a representation of something else. And what you've done here is simply assume that the event in itself is enough, and that the translation may as well be a translation or any other text, and you've forgotten about this other kinds of special force that may be of use to you in introducing new ways of thinking. So I would question whether these can be entirely disregarded. I would regard this as a non-trade-off solution, and I would suggest that a more sagacious approach would be to accept that the translation should manifest itself as a translation, if only to have more effect. This can work the other way. So I've been looking at behavior change communication, translations as event, and looking at the COVID communication. Okay, so we looked at COVID communication on official websites, which have the official terminology, the logo, etc., and speaks with authority. And we found that in the case of vaccination communication, in some communities in Melbourne, where we did interview studies on the reception of translations, that did not have an effect. That was not working. It was not considered reliable. People don't believe the government in some communities. And then we found a communication like this. I'll just play a little of it.
您好，我是皇家墨尔本医院的一位医护人员。 因为受到新冠病毒的影响，我们在这里寻求你的。
Okay. We just got hospital staff, people working in hospitals, different levels, nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers, explaining in their language, in their work environment, with very low cost video production, why they got vaccinated, why their family got vaccinated, produced by the hospital. Now, what's interesting is that this is successful to the community because this talking head achieves more trust, but it's a thick trust. It's because the person is speaking their language. It looks like the receiver. The person looks like the receiver. Often they have the status of a medical professional as well, which adds to the trust. Whereas the standard web-based linguistic translations simply have thin trust. It comes from the government. It's done by an official translator. What interests me here, of course, is that we've got the talking head speaking as a person, gaining thick trust to inspire, to make people want to get vaccinated, hopefully. And we have the subtitles, which have been produced professionally. They're good English. They're well segmented, well balanced, which introduce an element of control and thin trust there. Okay, that professional translators have worked with this non-professional communication, and both are working together to achieve a trade-off. Okay, and this is behavior change communication. It's an event. It's making people think differently.
您好，
Okay. What we found in that study, I'll just talk a bit about the COVID study in Melbourne, is that the communications that referred to science to government, to press releases, to journalists, to the people, that didn't work. There was not trust there. There was certainly rhizomatic trust, that people trusted the communications that were trusted by the people around them. So we get this system where there are many entry points and many exits and many nodes, and that the most effective communications, like the one I just showed you there of the person speaking in the video, achieved that by working socially within that kind of complex network. Now, back to my problem. Are there only two variables involved in a trade-off? No, I've said I think there is no limit. It's not a binary decision, and there may be other ones. However, in the data that we get, it seems to be that mainly two variables are mentioned. Either it's one, in which case it's not a trade-off, like I didn't understand it, or I understand that one better than that one, no trade-off, or two, and I don't know why. Okay, so I'll just present that as a problem. It may be because of the English sentence or predication, when it's hard to fit in more than two variables. The Chinese sentence, though, can fit in more. It's predication. You have multiple predication within the Chinese sentence, and even there, the verbalizations tend to have two variables at a time. It may also be because in the discussion, when we have the focus groups, public debate really settles on one or the other for two positions. But I just leave that as a problem that I can't solve. Problem number two, what kinds of asymmetry can be tolerated? So if we got solutions out here, for example, this is the slumbering fire example, the post-editing, the fully human, the MT. Can readers tolerate any kind of solution? If a solution is right in here, would it be successful, or up there or there? This goes back to psychological construct called tolerance of ambiguity, which has been studied in relation to translation and the reception of translations in some of the early work, actually, in the Think Aloud protocols. It really depends on who's doing the evaluation. Okay. But it seems to be that the more possible renditions that you can generate, the easier it is to maximize both variables at the same time. That is, in a text, if you can have a solution here and a solution there and a solution there, then it's possible to have more because you've built up knowledge about the variables involved. It's easier, for example, to have trade-offs in a retranslation or multiple retranslations because some of the basic information has been set in place by the previous translations. And then, of course, you may get situations where two different translations or three or four sort of occupy the same position, and you just get variables that are not pertinent. When that happens, we've probably made a mistake in identifying the variables here. If people are not arguing about it, then take it out and look for what they really do argue about or what they consider pertinent or what they're missing. Of course, this example shows us that you can get by with machine translation. You do get some degree of understanding. You do get some aesthetics. As long as people are aware of the cumulative risks, this could be a source of valid trade-offs. Although look what happens with just a little light post-editing. It becomes much, much better. Better in the sense of cooperative. Another problem is everything a trade-off. A trade-off's all we have. Now, I'm going to the work of a conservative economist, Thomas Sowell, here, who did argue that in economics, there are only trade-offs. There are no solutions, that everything has a cost somewhere else. And he accepts that this is because the social contract accepts limitations on the individual. I mentioned the political system needs a degree of freedom and a degree of stability at the same time. However, in this particular book, when he's talking about political ideologies, he recognizes that the constrained vision sees everything in terms of trade-off, whereas there is an unconstrained vision that doesn't, that operates in terms of absolute principles. So unconstrained vision would be Venuti's position that I cited there. A translation must be an event to set about new ways of thinking, and that's any newness is good. Okay, no prudence is necessary. And so, being a conservative economist, sees that as being the position of the left. You know, the grand principles that have to be applied across the board because this is the way to go, and it's truth. In one interview, he was a black economist. He's saying, "Oh, you want to get rid of the last traces of racial discrimination, but at what price?" So even there, as a black academic, he would say, "Well, yes, get rid of racial discrimination, but at what price? At what level do you stop doing this?" And obviously, if you think about it, you get to levels when certain fundamental structural discrimination has been overcome. You take your foot off that. Why? Because people don't know if they got their job because of their race or because of their merit. There is a price. There is a trade-off there to be sought. So our trade-offs all we have. There is the unconstrained vision, the great principle, and trade-offs tends to argue that prudence is required everywhere. Another way of looking at this, though, is to go back to this kind of table that we have and see that when one of the values near zero, as in connections here, or as in Guanxi down here, that is, we have a highly asymmetric trade-off. It's not really a trade-off. It's risk-taking. You're taking a real risk there. You're missing out on a whole side of business that is pertinent to some receivers. So what is risk-taking? A trade-off where one value near zero. Okay. What about when both values are near zero? It could be down here. This would be avoiding the problem altogether, playing it very safe, using generalization or using omission, as translators do. That would be risk aversion, okay, when you play it down here. It's interesting to consider that you could give a full explanation of Guanxi and probably get a value right out here, but it would be too long, okay, so it's going to contravene some other criterion that we have. Also, any explicitation is risk-taking as well. So even though I just said when a value is near zero, it's risk-taking. Adding too much information, adding information additional to the text is always running the risk of being wrong, basically. So there's other kinds of risk-taking involved as well as the ones that are near zero. And then I would propose that if one value here is an appeal to authority, to the preferences of the client, the wishes of the government, the official glossary of Microsoft, for example, then you have a case of risk transfer. So the trade-off model can be used to explain and locate other kinds of risk attitudes. Finally, what kind of research methodology is appropriate to the study of trade-offs? I think if we're looking at reception, which is what I have been doing, then obviously it's a trade-off itself. I think you do need enough quantity, enough data from people so that you can work bottom up from what people say and to ensure that the researcher is having interaction with an external world. That is, we're not just imposing our own visions. Oh, it's Schleiermacher said, foreignizing, domesticating, therefore it's foreignizing, domesticating. No, you do need the data. You do need the quantity in order to ensure that you are doing more than expressing your opinions or imposing accepted theories. And then you need enough quality, enough attention to the actual discourse, enough attention to the way we interpret those utterances about reception to make us reflect on our own position, to make the research process properly reflexive. You need both. What is it? It's a trade-off. It's a trade-off between the empirical, the interaction with the external world to make sure that we are learning and discovering something beyond ourselves. This is an interaction between the empirical and the reflexive. I invite you to explore trade-offs.